Hello, everybody. My name is Susan Kempinen, and welcome to another terrific program at the Merriwood Center. Thank you for joining us. Today's program is a part of our ongoing Presidential Legacies series. So we've had programs on Lyndon B. Johnson, Harry Truman, most recently FDR, but we started this series with Abraham Lincoln and Dr. Christian McWhirter, and he was the inspiration for this entire series because it was so well received. He was so amazing that people wanted more. So we have had featured
Unmute it first. This is that Zoom.
Oh,
I have a meeting to go to.
I'm gonna go ahead and mute that person. So we've featured many other presidents now, but we have Dr. McWhirter back for an encore presentation. And we picked February because President's Day is this month, it's Lincoln's birthday this month, it's also Black History Month. And so there are a lot of reasons why we thought having Dr. McWhirter back to talk about Abraham Lincoln was a perfect segue into this month of February. So let me tell you about Dr. McWhirter. Christian McWhirter is the Lincoln historian at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Museum and the author of Battle Hymns, The Power and Popularity of Music in the Civil War. He previously served as editor of the Journal of the Abraham Lincoln Association and as an assistant editor for the papers of the Abraham Lincoln Project. His writings on Lincoln, popular music, and the Civil War have appeared in numerous publications, including the New York Times, Chicago Sun-Times, and Washington Post. And this morning, he's back to talk about competing points of view on emancipation. And he's going to discuss Lincoln's actions in the broader context of the American Civil War and the anti-slavery movement. So thank you for being here today, Christian. And without further ado, I will turn things over to you.
Well, thank you, Susan, for that very generous introduction. The one thing she left out of my bio is that I have a cold. So I have a lozenge in my mouth right now, if you're wondering why I'm talking a little funny, and I've got some tea here for when that's over. So hopefully my voice will hold out. When I was here, well, and actually in housekeeping, she mentioned too, yeah, I'm going to keep the chat closed while I talk. This isn't really a discussion. I'm going to give a presentation, but then if you have questions, put them in the chat even as I'm talking. And then at the end of the talk, I'm going to try to leave about 15 minutes for Q&A. So like Susan said, you can ask me in the old fashioned way just by raising your hand. And then I or Susan will call on you. But if you want to put questions in the chat, I'll open it up when we're done. And then I'll address whatever I can in the chat too. So feel free to use that function. Just don't think I'm ignoring you. I'm just waiting until we get to the Q&A to talk about it. And the talk I'm giving today, this is one I've given a few times, and it's in part because of Q&A with the public, because working at a Lincoln museum, I get a lot of questions about emancipation and Lincoln's role in it. Most of you were probably taught in school or elsewhere that Lincoln was the great emancipator and that Lincoln destroyed slavery. And, this was Lincoln's greatest achievement. Much like with everything in history, the truth is often much more complicated. And Lincoln himself, he played a significant role in the destruction of slavery, and we'll talk about that. But there's been an argument among historians since Lincoln's own time over how did slavery meet its end in America and who was most responsible. So I developed this talk as a way to kind of create an accessible way to get at that debate. Don't get scared off. I'm not going to talk about which historians said what, where, that kind of thing. This won't be a talk about historians arguing it, but I am going to provide basically who the different players were in destroying the institution of slavery, how it came about, and then leaving it partly up to you I'll give my take at the end, but partly up to you to make up your own minds, because this is something we still argue about. The Civil War was a big event. It was a complicated event. slavery was a well-entrenched institution in America, and it's a complicated issue. So this isn't to diminish. I always have to be careful. I said this isn't to diminish Lincoln or to say that Lincoln, had nothing to do with it. I'm just going to try to present what the kind of competing sides of this argument are and the debate. So I think what I'd like to do when I start this talk is to put us in the beginning of the Civil War, put us in April of 1861, and at that time, what did the participants in the war think the war was about? What role did they think slavery played in the coming of the Civil War? We can argue about what Lincoln thought in 1861. I want to start by saying what Lincoln thought 4 years later on March 4th, 1865. Lincoln's second inaugural address is probably his second most famous speech. Besides the Gettysburg Address, the part everybody knows from that speech is the "with malice toward none" part at the end. But a big chunk of that speech, the whole middle of that speech, is Lincoln explaining to his audience why he thinks the Civil War happened and the role of slavery in the coming of the Civil War. So we might as well start with him, right? Lincoln is a good authority on these things. So this is what Lincoln says about the coming of the Civil War, and it is the longest quote I'll say today, so bear with me. On the occasion corresponding to this, he means his inauguration, his original inauguration. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it, all sought to avert it. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union, even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration which it has already attained. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease with, or even before the conflict itself should cease. Each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any man should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. But let us judge not, that we be not judged. So this is Lincoln, 4 years into the war and a month before his assassination, telling us that he thinks the war was about slavery, essentially, right? That slavery is the underlying cause of the war. It's what leads to secession, and that the South is overreacted to his election. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's break down at the time what different people are saying. And I want to start with the Confederates themselves, in terms of who in 1861 thinks the war is about slavery, because nobody is more open about the war being about slavery and slavery being a major factor in the war than the Confederates themselves. The Articles of Secession, right, the resolutions that various Southern states passed to break away from the United States and eventually form the Confederacy, a lot of them are pretty explicit about why they're doing it. I'm going to read to you a paragraph from Mississippi's Articles of Secession. Mississippi says, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth. These products are peculiar to climate verging on the tropical regions, and by an imperious law of nature, none but the black race can bear exposure to the tropical sun. These products have become necessities of the world. And a blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. That blow has been long aimed at the institution and was at the point of reaching its consummation. There was no choice left us but submission to the mandates of abolition or a dissolution of the Union, whose principles had been subverted to work out our ruin. What Mississippi is saying at the end of that paragraph is they believed they had gotten to a point where the federal government was being hijacked by abolitionists and they were going to destroy the institution of slavery. What they mean, the exact event they're referring to is Lincoln's election. They believed that Lincoln's election in November of 1860 meant that the federal government was going to begin attacking slavery, and so they had no choice but to leave the Union to protect the institution of slavery. Lincoln, of course, said no such thing at the time. So that's in Mississippi says that, I believe, in December of 1860. Fast forwarding to shortly after Lincoln's first inaugural address, where he pleads with the South to not secede, to come back to the Union, the Confederate vice president, Alexander Stephens, makes his famous, what we now call cornerstone speech on March 21st, 1861 in Savannah, Georgia. This is Alexander Stephens describing what he believes is the foundation of the Confederate government. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. So that's the Confederates. The Confederates are 100% saying this war is about slavery. It's about the preservation of slavery. We are creating an independent nation separate from the United States to perpetuate the institution of slavery. So if we're going down our list of participants in the Civil War saying who in 1861 thinks the war is about slavery, the Confederates get a resounding yes. But let's look at the North. In the North, you have a few competing groups, and the two biggest groups that we want to talk about to start with are Democrats and Republicans, right? What do the two different political parties, where do they stand on slavery and its role in the coming Civil War? Northern Democrats, most Northern Democrats, that party itself is in the process of splitting, right? As you might recall, they split their ticket in the election of 1860, which is partly how Lincoln is able to win. There's still a divided party in the North in 1861, but the majority of them believe in the Union. So one of the things we can say about the Democratic Party in the North is most of them believe secession is illegal, like Lincoln and the Republicans do, but they are, for the most part, opposed to any action by the federal government against the institution of slavery. They have no, again, I'm generalizing here, right? Most Northern Democrats have no moral objection to the institution of slavery. They're not anti-slavery advocates. Most anti-slavery advocates or abolitionists have drifted in the Republican Party by 1861. So most Democrats have no moral objection to slavery, believe it's just part of the nation. And what they would like to see is the South brought back into the Union and a restoration of basically the way things were in the 1850s. So they're kind of a mix of Stephen Douglas, who at that time is the leader of the Democratic Party. He ran against Lincoln in 1860. Of course, famously, Lincoln challenged him for the Senate in 1858. Douglas will die shortly after the Civil War begins, so he's not going to last through the war. But Douglas's position, as you might recall, is that slavery, should be allowed to extend into the Western states, that each of the new Western states as they're created should vote for themselves, whether they should be slave states or not. He calls this popular sovereignty. This has disastrous results in Kansas, leads to the whole bleeding Kansas thing. But many Democrats still believe in this principle, that people should be able to choose for themselves, or states should be able to choose for themselves, whether they're slave states or free states. But the Dred Scott decision has also come about by that time, which is the Supreme Court decision. late in the 1850s that says that African Americans have no rights that a white man is bound to respect, basically enshrining in the Constitution the idea of white supremacy. And so many Democrats agree with that as well. So there's some combination of those two things. Many Northern Democrats believe racial integration is impossible. They do not believe that white and black people can live together harmoniously. And so that's one of the reasons they're devoted to the institution of slavery. This is true for many white Southerners as well, that they believe that if you get rid of slavery, there's going to be disastrous consequences because white and black people simply cannot live together. And Democrats don't generally blame the Confederates for the war. Many of them blame the Republicans for the war, that by being an anti-slavery party, they have forced the Confederates to secede, which is similar to what you heard in the Mississippi statement and the Cornerstone speech. And so the real problem in America is not the slaveholding states, and that's led to the Civil War. It's the Republican Party in challenging the institution of slavery. Many Democrats believe that as well. And so what they would like to see, and they almost pull off early in the war, is a constitutional amendment or some other means that guarantees the existence of slavery in the United States, because that would appease the South, bring them back to the Union. It's a political solution and will result in no bloodshed. That's where the Democrats are when the war breaks out. But the Republicans are in power. One of the ironies of the Civil War is that Lincoln gets elected president, right? And this freaks out Southern Democrats and to a lesser extent Northern Democrats. But Democrats would have held Congress. One of the ironies of the Civil War is, of course, once the Confederate states break away, all of their congressmen, right, because women couldn't serve office then, so we can just say congressmen, all their congressmen get up and leave Congress, right? And they go serve in the Confederate Congress instead. This gives the Republicans a majority. So the Republicans, ironically, get control of the entire federal government, except the Supreme Court, in 1861 because of secession. So the Republicans are basically calling all the shots politically, at least at the federal level. So it really matters more than these other groups in terms of the slavery debate and emancipation. It really matters what Republicans think because they're running the show. But the Republicans are a loose coalition. The Republican Party is at this point only 6 or 7 years old. It was a coalition born of former Whigs, anti-slavery advocates, members of the Know Nothing movement, who coalesced primarily around opposition to Stephen Douglas's popular sovereignty policies. The only real consensus in the Republican Party on the issue of slavery is that it should not spread. And that was Lincoln's platform in 1860. It was not to get rid of slavery. It was to keep it from expanding any further west than where it already is. Now, they believe that, they argue for that because they believe that will ultimately kill slavery, that if you keep slavery where it exists, it'll eventually die out on its own. So ultimately, their goal is to get rid of slavery, but they're playing a very long game, and a game, that isn't as immediate as the Confederates think it is. Many of them have a moral objection to slavery. They believe that slavery is wrong. Many believe slavery is sinful, but we shouldn't overestimate how many white Republicans believe that. One of the things the early Republican Party stands for is the idea of America as a society where anyone can rise, right? Based on the merits, or at least in this case, any white man can rise based on the merits of their own skills, right? People like Abraham Lincoln, right? Abraham Lincoln goes from a log cabin to the White House. They believe in this. And some of them oppose slavery on those grounds. They don't really care about black people. It's not because they believe slavery is horrible and it's racist. It's because they believe the institution of slavery and the fact that there's an enslaved class of non-whites in America is a barrier to people rising through American society, right? Because you have this huge group of working class jobs that are not available to white people, right? So some of them oppose the institution of slavery on those grounds, right? So I always like to make that distinction because I think we often assume that if you oppose slavery, therefore you must have believed in racial equality or you believe slavery was a moral wrong. Well, there's a whole spectrum there, right, of reasons to oppose the institution of slavery. And they're all present in the Republican Party. And Lincoln and the Republican Congress are going to have to balance all these things. So like I said, like this creates kind of a baseline tension in the Republican Party throughout the war from agreeing that slavery must be destroyed, right? You know, I'm not spoiling anything to say that eventually there'll be an Emancipation Proclamation, right? But the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't happen until January 1st, 1863, right? That's well into the war. So part of the reason that's why it takes so long, the federal government isn't immediately committed to the idea of destroying slavery. And so during the early part of the war, that debate will split Congress. Lincoln is probably at this time slightly on the side of what we could call the moralists, the people that believe slavery is a moral wrong, but he's not willing to speak out against slavery in 1861 or even in most of 1862. Almost no Republicans in 1861, I think this is worth saying, would consider arming African Americans to fight for the Union. That is by vast minority opinion. And of course, we know that will change. Even less would have endorsed the idea of Black citizenship or giving Black men the right to vote, which again will start to change during the Civil War. What's more, and this is important to remember too, is that many Republicans, especially Lincoln, believe that most white Southerners don't agree with secession. They believe that the majority of white Southerners are Unionists who've been hoodwinked into going along with secession. And so if you are easy on them in the Civil War, you can persuade them back into the Union. And so that's another reason to not go after slavery, because if the Union Army and the federal government start going after slavery, you might push those people away, right? And you want to ease them back in. That's in the early days, that's how the North thinks they're going to win the war. But there's another group, moving away then from Republicans, again, just setting the table here. There's another group that we often don't talk about in the slavery debate. That's an important group that I think exerts a heavy influence, which is the enslaved people themselves. What do they think the Civil War is about? Well, of course, it's hard to find out exactly what enslaved people believe because literacy for enslaved people is illegal in most parts of the South, and they don't leave us a lot of written records, but we can gauge things by their actions or what other people are telling us about them or what they recall later. And it's pretty clear that the enslaved immediately recognized secession's potential for ending slavery. They knew this war was about slavery. They knew the South was fighting to preserve slavery, and they knew that they could, or they tried to come up with strategies to convince the North that that was so. They benefited from what we now call the plantation grapevine. There was a whole network of, we think of enslaved people as being isolated in these plantations or in these homes. There was a whole grapevine. They were able to pass information to each other fairly easily. We know this happened. And so the news that there is a war and that this is what it's about, their enslavers are telling them, they're lying to them, saying Lincoln's going to come and he's going to do horrible things to you. They know that's not true. They're passing information to each other. They know what the war is about, and they're telling each other. And so almost immediately they begin resisting the Confederacy and hurting its ability to wage war. They sabotage things happening on the plantation or other, like some of them are put to work in industrial places or helping the army. They'll slow their work. They'll secretly sabotage things they're doing. And then eventually what they'll start to do is run away. They will understand that the easiest way to hurt the Confederacy and help the Union is to run away. And they will do this when the Union Army gets close by. They recognize that US troops are a potential asset to helping them gain their freedom. So when US forces are close by, we start to see enslaved people running away from where they live, going to the US Army and offering themselves up to the US Army as sources of information, as sources of labor. And so this forces both sides then to acknowledge slavery's role in the conflict and also makes it a real thing, right? Now these white Northerners are encountering African-American people who want to help the North win the war. But it will come slowly. And we'll talk a little more about that their involvement and the reactions the North has to it is something that will develop slowly. So then, who are the real players in this debate about slavery's destruction? Well, I think we can dismiss the Confederates now, right? The Confederates, they're not arguing about the role of slavery in the war. They know the role of slavery in the war. They've got their own objective, which is to preserve slavery. Only at the end of the war do the Confederates themselves begin arguing about the role of slavery in their nation. Very near the end of the war, they offer the opportunity for African Americans to serve in the Confederate Army in exchange for their freedom, but it's so late in the war that it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really have an effect. If we're going to say the Confederates have any role, there's an ironic role, which is that because the Confederates fight so well, and because the war lasts as long as it does, that gives room, or that creates a crisis in the North that will lead to the North taking action against slavery, right? If the North is able to defeat the Confederacy quickly, right, in a parallel, in an imaginary history, probably slavery remains intact and the Emancipation Proclamation never happens. The ironic thing about the South is they fight so well to preserve slavery, they end up helping its destruction because they motivate Northerners to oppose the institution of slavery more than they already do, but we'll get to that. They also, by fighting so well, destroy this myth of a majority, of this Unionist majority, right? That Northerners, and especially Lincoln, believe is there. That goes away because they fight so well, right? So if these guys are fighting so well, they must be committed to the cause. I think we can dismiss Democrats as well, because the Democrats are ultimately powerless. As I said, the Republicans are controlling the reins of power. The Democrats are never, on the federal level, able to regain it during the Civil War. They come close in the election of 1864. George McClellan almost defeats Lincoln for the presidency in 1864, but he doesn't. So I don't think we don't need to talk about Democrats anymore either. So who do we need to talk about? We need to talk about three groups, two of which I've already mentioned: the Republicans, who are running the government, the enslaved themselves, and then the other group that I've alluded to, but we haven't really talked about yet, is the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army is the other big factor. They are standing both inside and outside of this debate because, of course, the U.S. Army is made up of Democrats and Republicans and people who just don't care at all and have no political affiliation, right? That's who constitutes the U.S. Army, but they're going to be the ones who are going to encounter this face to face, right? They're going to start to penetrate into the South and encounter enslaved people and encounter the slave system. Furthermore, the U.S. Army's objective is to win the war. And so their attitudes on slavery are probably going to mostly be shaped by what they think is going to help them defeat the Confederacy the easiest. And over time, they're going to start to see slavery, destroying slavery, as a strategy in that. Which of these three groups had more influence and whose decisions or actions were most critical to securing emancipation is what historians argue about. We've been debating this subject for decades. Every few months, a new book will come that gives a new wrinkle. So I'm just going to, again, try to give you the state of kind of where that debate is at now that I've set the table. So I'm going to go into these three groups one at a time, and I'm going to start with the government. And I'm just going to take you through what the government does that eventually leads to the destruction of slavery, because I think that's the narrative we're all most familiar with, right? This idea that Lincoln and the Republicans destroyed slavery. So let's go through that narrative. So the first thing the government does directly against the institution of slavery is when Congress passes the first Confiscation Act on August 6, 1861, or actually more, on that day, Lincoln signs it into law. But I want to be very clear that this is not a Lincoln initiative. Congress initiates this. Lincoln just goes along with it. What the first Confiscation Act does is it authorizes commanders to confiscate property of citizens openly supporting the Confederacy. So that means anyone that a general or commander in the field, doesn't necessarily have to be a general, any officer in the field, if they determine that someone is supporting the Confederacy, they are authorized to confiscate their property to help the U.S. war effort. But this is vague, right? These commanders in the field have to determine for themselves whether the people they're dealing with are supporting the Confederacy or not. It also doesn't explicitly address slavery itself. Now, let me be clear, right? Enslaved people are property in the United States, right? That's what slavery is. It's turning a person into property. So implied in this act is that you could confiscate, potatoes to feed your troops and things like that. You could confiscate enslaved people and use their labor. But this act isn't really explicit too much about enslaved people themselves. It also doesn't say what happens to those enslaved people. What is their status once you confiscate them? Are they free, right? Do they go back to being enslaved after the war? The first Confiscation Act doesn't say. This leads to enslaved people being in this kind of middle space, which you've probably heard that sometimes runaways or freed people in the Civil War referred to as contrabands, right? That's where this word comes from, because they're contraband of war, right? They're property that has been confiscated by the army to use in the war effort. That's where this word contraband comes from. The Second Confiscation Act, signed by Lincoln a year later on July 17th, 1862, again, an effort from Congress more than Lincoln himself, tries to resolve some of this by making the laws regarding this more explicit. It expressly declares that all slaves of citizens actively aiding the rebellion, whether those slaves are actively involved in the war or not, shall be deemed, quote, captives of war and forever free. Obviously, forever free will show up in another document that I'm sure you're more familiar with. So what this means then is, so if you confiscate an enslaved person, they get their freedom, right? That's essentially what it's saying. It just clarifies that. It still, though, requires what makes the Second Confiscation Act not the Emancipation Proclamation or something bigger is you still have to be disloyal, right? So it still requires commanders, U.S. commanders in the field to determine if the person enslaving these people is loyal to the Confederacy. If so, then you can free their enslaved property, but you have to determine that first, right? And that's up to the people in the field. Around this same time that Lincoln signs this act, Lincoln is considering an Emancipation Proclamation. In the summer of 1862, the war is going very badly for the Union, and this whole recalibration is happening in the Union to what historians call hard war. And part of hard war is taking direct action against slavery. Lincoln has become convinced, because the Confederacy is fighting so well, that action needs to be taken. Lincoln first meets with his Secretary of State, William Seward, and his Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, on July 13th, 1862, and tells them he's thinking about issuing an Emancipation Proclamation. On July 22nd, he meets with his entire cabinet and tells them he's issuing an Emancipation Proclamation. Let me be very clear about what that is, because I think what the Emancipation Proclamation actually is something we argue about a lot and people get confused about. Lincoln very much believes in the rule of law, right? Lincoln's a lawyer. So Lincoln, in his Emancipation Proclamation, is taking a military action. What Lincoln believes is that he's empowered as commander-in-chief to take war measures against the states that are rebelling, right? So the Emancipation Proclamation is a declaration based on winning the war. That's what it is. That's what Lincoln thinks empowers him to do that. Most people think that to make slavery illegal, there has to be a constitution or a congressional act or a constitutional amendment. The Emancipation Proclamation, which Lincoln announces on September 22nd, but it won't go into effect until January 1st, is very explicit in what it does. What he says on September 22nd is all the states in a state of rebellion, the Confederate states, if they rejoin the Union by January 1st, 1863, if they don't rejoin the Union, I should say, by January 1st, 1863, all enslaved people in those states will be henceforth and forever free. So he's not freeing, right? Lincoln takes some heat, as you're probably familiar with, for not freeing all the slaves everywhere. Well, Lincoln didn't believe he was empowered to do that, right? Lincoln thinks he can only do this over the states currently in rebellion, because that's what he's empowered to do as commander-in-chief through the Union Army. So that's what he's saying in the Emancipation Proclamation. The other argument is that then he doesn't actually free anyone, right? Because in those areas that are in a state of rebellion, Lincoln has no actual power, right? Because they're part of the Confederacy. But what he's doing is, so then this complements the Second Confiscation Act, is now these commanders in the field don't have to distinguish if enslaved people are the property of a disloyal owner or not, right? Now, anywhere the Union Army goes, any enslaved person they encounter is free. That's what the Emancipation Proclamation does. And of course, as you know, those Confederate states don't come back by January 1st, 1863, so it goes into effect. It also, of course, enables African Americans to join the Union Army, right? Which is another important thing it does that will matter later. Lincoln argued just before he issues the Emancipation Proclamation, he says, in giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free. So this shows Lincoln's evolving views on slavery. think about that quote the next time you read the Gettysburg Address and Lincoln talks about a new birth of freedom, right? Lincoln is aware that with the Emancipation Proclamation, he is redefining what America is about and slavery's role in it. Lincoln also understands how critical it is to arm African Americans, and that by greenlighting that process, he's making a big difference. 3 months after the Emancipation Proclamation, he tells Andrew Johnson, his future vice president, the colored population is the great available and yet unavailed of force for restoring the Union. The bare sight of 50,000 armed and drilled black soldiers on the banks of Mississippi would end the rebellion at once. So that's what Lincoln's trying to achieve here. As I said, though, it does not include states that remained loyal to the Union or had been brought back into the Union. Those states continue to have legal slavery. Furthermore, because it's a military order, Lincoln cannot guarantee, he's worried that when the war's over, will it still go into effect, or can the Supreme Court overturn it, right? You need a permanent measure to destroy slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation is enough. And that's why when Lincoln gets reelected in 1864, he really starts pressing hard for a constitutional amendment, right? The 13th Amendment passes the Senate in the summer of 1864, but it doesn't pass the House until January 31st, 1865, which if you've seen the Lincoln movie, Spielberg's Lincoln movie, that's what that movie is about. It will not, however, be ratified until December 18th, 1865. So one thing, but what the 13th Amendment does is it permanently outlaws the institution of slavery. And so it's one thing to keep in mind. It's a correction I'm always making of people here when we're talking about the Emancipation Proclamation or Juneteenth or anything like that. The institution of slavery in America isn't officially destroyed until December 18th, 1865, when the 13th Amendment is ratified. That's the actual date. It makes no provisions, however, though, for what happens to African Americans or formerly enslaved people once they're freed. And that will lead to the 14th and 15th Amendments during Reconstruction, which is another talk. And that's why they have to come later. So let's reflect on what I just said, though. So I just showed you a process through which the federal government goes from being gentle on slavery to permanently getting rid of slavery, right? And which is the narrative most of us are told. And that's very important, right? That the federal government does that. But it also takes 4 years, more than 4 years for this to happen, right? So the government is moving relatively slowly on this while a war is going on the ground. So what's driving this process, right? What is influencing, what's making its way up to the halls of Congress and the White House to make this happen? Well, that's where we have to talk about the two other groups I mentioned. So let's talk about the Army. So while all this is going on, right, going back to the beginning of the war, you have all these U.S. officers on the ground going into the South who are suddenly encountering enslaved people. They're either encountering enslaved people in Southern homes that they're occupying or reaching, and they're encountering all these runaway enslaved people that I mentioned before. So this leads a lot of U.S. officers to have two kind of important realizations. One is they realize the Confederacy is using its enslaved labor to help it wage war, right? That it's using these enslaved people to build ammunition, to build weapons. It's allowing white Southerners to go serve in the Confederate Army because they're often their spouses, often the women of the Confederacy, are back home managing in the enslaved property, and that's keeping their farms going, right? And so the fact that you have all these enslaved people in the South is helping the Confederates staff their armies, right? And so white Northerners are understanding these. It also, it's Union soldiers who first start to realize that this idea that most Southerners white Southerners oppose the Confederacy is a myth, right? They start encountering white Southerners, and white Southerners are not nice to them, and it's difficult to occupy the white South. So they also quickly realize, okay, white Southerners are committed to the Confederacy. Slavery is a key thing keeping the Confederacy going. We should do something about this. And it's also worth noting that a lot of these white soldiers are encountering enslaved people, or sometimes even African Americans, period, for the first time, right? They've read about slavery in newspapers or maybe in Uncle Tom's Cabin, but they've never encountered it. And that clearly has an effect on them. It makes them, if it doesn't make them morally opposed to slavery, it nevertheless makes them more committed to maybe destroying this institution along with the Confederacy, which I think the evidence for that is the 1864 election. When Lincoln runs for re-election in 1864, a vast majority of soldiers vote for Lincoln. And I think that shows that a lot of them have really come to oppose the Confederacy, oppose slavery, and approve of the Emancipation Proclamation and maybe the 13th Amendment too. The best kind of concrete story where this is happening is at Fortress Monroe. Fortress Monroe is out at the end of the Virginia Peninsula. Benjamin Butler is given command of it at the beginning of the war. And it's one of the first places where these runaways begin to encounter Union soldiers. And they start approaching Fortress Monroe. They ask if they can come inside. They offer to help Union forces there by building entrenchments or doing whatever. They offer to tell them where the Confederates are and what they're doing. And, that's a real crapshoot for these African Americans, right? They don't know. At this point, there's no policy on what to do with this, right? So some of these Union commanders could just return them to where they were enslaved, where they would surely be punished for running away. They could do something awful to them themselves, or they could let them in. Well, Butler's the one who lets them in. But Butler has to figure out a way to justify this. And the way Butler justifies it is he says, well, these people are property. They're property of people rebelling against the United States, so I can confiscate them as contraband. Sound familiar, right? That idea filters its way up to Congress and becomes the first Confiscation Act. But it comes from these commanders on the ground. They're the ones first doing this, especially Butler. And as the war goes on, this idea spreads more and more. As the Union begins to occupy more and more territory, more and more Union officers begin treating enslaved people as confiscated property. And then eventually Congress gives them their blessing in doing that. Eventually what this does is it turns Union armies into magnets for runaways. Wherever the US Army goes in the South, African Americans will run away and join the Union Army. And this often has positive results for these African Americans. It gets them their freedom. They're sent to contraband camps. They're allowed to help the army. It doesn't always, though, because remember, the army, as I mentioned earlier, is made up of people from all political stripes. So Democrats, for instance, some prominent Democrats like George McClellan, who for the first part of the war is in charge of all Union forces, opposes all of this and is very reluctant to confiscate enslaved property. Others, other like more conservative Republicans, guys like William Tecumseh Sherman, believe that this is a radical position. They don't like to be allied with what they think is abolitionism. It makes them uncomfortable. What happens, though, what happens to a lot of white soldiers in the Union Army, though, is they recognize that confiscating slaves and attacking slavery is the best way to win the war. And I'm going to give you a couple quotes from Ulysses S. Grant. I think Grant is a good example of one of these people. Ulysses S. Grant is a Democrat before the war. He says he would have voted for Douglas if he voted in the election of 1860. By the end of the war, he's a Republican and then later becomes the second Republican president. So Grant says in 1863, so this is right around when the Emancipation Proclamation is going into effect, Grant says, I was never an abolitionist, but I tried to judge fairly and honestly, and it became patent in my mind early in the rebellion that the North and South could never live at peace with each other except as one nation, and that without slavery. As anxious as I am to see peace established, I would not therefore be willing to see any settlement until the question is forever settled. So this is Grant deciding during the war, okay, slavery's got to go or this rebellion is just going to happen over again. He's more blunt in his memoir. Grant writes a classic memoir before near the end of his life, and this is how he describes the Confederate surrender at Appomattox. He says, I felt like anything rather than rejoicing at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly and had suffered so much for a cause. Though that cause was, I believe, one of the worst for which a people ever fought and one for which there was the least excuse. So near the end of his life, Grant is reflecting that the Confederate cause was one of the worst for which anyone ever fought for. And by that, he means preserving slavery. Eventually, as the Emancipation Proclamation comes into effect, you'll see people in the Army who are committed abolitionists, then they start to get their day. Guys like Thomas Wentworth Higginson and Robert Gould Shaw, who command black regiments, that's where they start to exert more and more influence, but it takes a while. Butler, I think, is more typical, right? Butler's a Democrat who the experience of the war turns him into an anti-slavery advocate. And these guys will stay anti-slavery after the war. But Sherman is a good example of the limits of this. There's a really tragic episode during Sherman's march, where as Sherman makes his way through Georgia, remember I mentioned these Union armies are acting as magnets for enslaved people to run away. As Sherman makes his way through Georgia, he attracts thousands of African Americans who just start to follow his army as he goes from Atlanta to Savannah. And Sherman has to feed them. And Sherman considers this a problem. Sherman remains a white supremacist really for the rest of his life. And there's a really tragic episode at Ebenezer Creek. You can look up the details, but essentially Confederate cavalry are closing in on one wing of Sherman's army, and they have to cross a river at Ebenezer Creek and there's this huge, number of Black refugees behind Sherman's army. And when they get across the bridge, Union soldiers cut that bridge, and the Black refugees are not able to cross the river. And they panic and they go into the river. It's cold, so a lot of them die of exposure in the river. And then eventually the Confederate cavalry arrive and kill and capture a bunch of them as well. A really tragic circumstance that shows the limits of where these white officers get to, right? Sherman is still capable of taking an action like that, even though he's committed to destroying slavery late in the Civil War, right? All right, let's talk about the enslaved for a little while and then we're done. The last group. Enslaved people have a long history before the Civil War of using conflict, using wars to try to get their freedom. Almost every war that takes place during the colonies and United States history, you can see enslaved people offering themselves up to the US Army and the government to try to win their freedom. The example that most people are probably familiar with is Dunmore's proclamation during the Revolutionary War, which is when the British governor of Virginia offers to give freedom to any African American who joins the British Army to put down the rebellion, and many do, right? That's enslaved people using the war to try to win their freedom. The Civil War is no different, but it's surely the most fervent and concentrated attempt, probably since the American Revolution, for African Americans to do this. In fact, some scholars consider the Civil War the largest slave revolt in American history. That if you look at the number of enslaved people in America and you look at their actions, you could call the Civil War, along with a revolt of white Southerners against the federal government, it's simultaneously a revolt of Black Southerners against the institution of slavery. And as I mentioned, they put pressure on Union forces immediately by making themselves present, by running away to Union lines. They also make themselves, as I've said before, useful to the federal government, the US Army. They offer to serve as informants. They volunteer where Confederate positions are to tell the Union, okay, they're entrenched here, they're entrenched there. There's a couple incidents early in the war where the Union is able to win battles because enslaved people tell them, yeah, there's like a secret, ford over a river over there that you can use to get behind the Confederate line, things like that. And they resist Confederate service, right? Confederates are trying to use them to dig their own trenches and things like that. They run away or they sabotage efforts to slow down the Confederate war effort. As this policy shifts, they observe what the Union is doing. They observe that the federal government, the US Army, is taking more actions against slavery, and they begin to resist, right? And their resistance increases the more these actions happen. So you can see these things are happening in tangent with each other, right? The overwhelming numbers of them, by the time they really start to clue into what's going on in the halls of Congress, there's just an overwhelming number of African Americans running away and reaching the Union Army. And so it makes it impossible for Union commanders to turn them away. And then, of course, as that gets codified, as these things get codified in the White House and Congress, US officers on the ground stop having any choice over what to do about this, right? They start letting these African Americans through their lines because that's what they've been ordered to do. Regardless of how they feel about slavery, they have to do it anyway. Once African Americans get behind Union lines, they begin to express their loyalty to the Union and their opposition to slavery, which influences white observers, right? White people who start encountering these runaways see that they're loyal to the United States, they oppose the institution of slavery, and that increases their desire to want to help them, or at least use them as a resource against the Confederacy. And that's what happens then with the Emancipation Proclamation. African Americans are authorized to join the Union. About 180,000 of them join the US Army after the Emancipation Proclamation. By the end of the war, they constitute about 10% of the entire US Army. 19,000 of them join the Navy. This is essential. Really, if you look at this US Army stuff, you can draw a straight line from these African Americans running away early in the war to getting behind Union lines, to them being given guns and being allowed to fight for the Union. It's the clearest example you can get of what some of these things I've been talking about. the service of African Americans in the U.S. Army then inspires a movement to give African American men citizenship. By the end of the war, you see several people, especially Abraham Lincoln, start advocating for Black men to have the right to vote. And the excuse, or the reason they often give for why Black men should get the right to vote, is they fought so well in the Union Army. If they're going to fight for us, we should give them the right to vote. So this is a major step forward from where they were at the beginning of the war. And this actually results in Lincoln's assassination. Lincoln proposes Black voting rights in the last speech he ever gives on April 11th. And John Wilkes Booth is in the audience. And up to that point, John Wilkes Booth just wanted to kidnap Abraham Lincoln and ransom him for Confederate independence. It's hearing Lincoln say he wants to give Black people the right to vote that convinces Booth he has to shoot Lincoln. And Lincoln dies for that opinion. He gets shot for it 3 days later and dies the following morning. And so this has led many to argue that we should give the enslaved people credit for earning their own freedom. And I think there's a lot of merit to that argument. But we have to acknowledge, and I'm kind of wrapping up here because I know some of you asked questions, but we have to acknowledge that they needed the army and the government to collaborate with those efforts, right? Whatever the enslaved people were doing, they couldn't have pulled it off so successfully unless the U.S. Army is there. You need the U.S. Army in the South to give these enslaved people somewhere to run away to and to offer themselves up to. Even with Butler, let's pretend Benjamin Butler is much more racist or committed to slavery than he was. What happens then, right? Does that pipeline to Fortress Monroe ever get created? We don't know, but probably not. In terms of politics, what if the federal government doesn't go along with it? What if George McClellan wins in 1864? Does George McClellan reverse the Emancipation Proclamation and the Confiscation Acts? We don't know, but it could have happened. So you've probably guessed at this point where I land on this, which is the Civil War created a very unique circumstance to destroy the institution of slavery in America. It put the ingredients in place that allowed the government, the army, and enslaved people themselves to work together, even if they didn't always realize they were working together, to work together to destroy the institution of slavery. This is not how it went down in other places too, right? If you look at other places, like for instance in Haiti, the institution of slavery is entirely destroyed by a slave revolt, right? The enslaved people, they do that themselves. In other places, it's all through government action. Governments agree to abolish the institution of slavery and get rid of it. In America, we needed a civil war. We needed a massive war that created exactly the right circumstances for slavery to be destroyed. As I mentioned earlier, and the war had to play out the way it did too, right? Remember I said before, what if Lincoln wins the war? What if the North wins the war in early 1862 and the South is brought back in? Lincoln at that point never issues an Emancipation Proclamation. The Second Confiscation Act is never passed. What does American history look like then? Well, slavery probably survives the war. And how long does it last after that? We don't know. So you need the specific circumstance of the Civil War and these different players to do what they do and be where they are for slavery to be destroyed. But having said all that, you really do have to acknowledge, and this is what's often forgotten in the story though, the role of African Americans. I'm resisting a little bit the argument that African Americans freed themselves and should get all the credit for destroying the institution of slavery. They're taking the biggest chances though, right? They're being the bravest in this, where they're running away from their enslavers, they're reaching Union lines, right? They're taking that initiative. And probably if that never happens, probably the other pieces don't happen either. So it's an interesting dynamic. We can argue about it. Historians have always argued about it, but I wanted to give you all an overview because it's much more complicated, I think, than we're usually taught. So I'm going to leave it there. If you have any questions for me, feel free to let me know. And I hope this was interesting for you. Thank you.
So there are a couple questions in the chat.
Okay.
And
Yeah, I see them here.
John Reichman would like to know, was the abolishment of slavery in Europe of any consequence in the U.S.? And what was the status of slavery in the rest of the world, the Caribbean?
Yeah, and I kind of touched on that a little bit at the end. So in the Caribbean, there had been some emancipation based on actions of enslaved people themselves. Again, massive revolt in Haiti is the most successful one. By the time we get to the Civil War, most of the European world the European controlled world, right? This is the age of imperialism, right? Had abolished the institution of slavery. The United States is one of the last countries to get rid of the institution of slavery. In terms of American interests, they're really most interested in what the United Kingdom has done. And the United Kingdom abolishes slavery a few decades before the Civil War, and that's a major motivating force for the anti-slavery movement in America. And a lot of what makes that happen is the slave trade. It's the horrors of the African slave trade, the publication of what's going on in the Middle Passage and things like that. That leads to there being a big anti-slavery movement in the UK. And it complicates the whole issue of slavery in the United States and it being maintained in the United States. So that's definitely something that's happening both before and during the Civil War, and that's on people's minds.
E. Berman would like to know, did Lincoln have slaves at one time?
That is a very common myth about Abraham Lincoln, that Abraham Lincoln was at one time a slaveholder. Abraham Lincoln never owned slaves himself. There's several places that myth comes from. One is, of course, Lincoln is born in a slave state. He's born in Kentucky, and he lives on a farm, and a lot of farms in Kentucky used enslaved labor. There is no evidence that Thomas Lincoln, Lincoln's father, ever used enslaved labor on his property. And in fact, one of the reasons he moves his family to Indiana is to get away from the slave system. Now, whether he did that because he morally opposed the institution of slavery or because competing with other farmers who used enslaved labor was too difficult for him, we don't really know. But we know that's one of the reasons he left Indiana, was to get away from the slave system. The other source of that myth about Lincoln is that Lincoln does employ African Americans as house servants here in Springfield. And one in particular is indentured, and that's very close to slavery, although Lincoln isn't the one who indentures her. She's already indentured when he gets her to work for him, but she is not a slave. So Lincoln never himself owned slaves. Oh, there's one other thing I should mention too, which is that Mary comes from a slaveholding family. The other kind of myth about Lincoln owning slaves is that he inherits slaves when Mary's father passes away. Mary's father is a very prominent Kentucky politician who owns a number of enslaved people. And Mary is raised by an enslaved woman, essentially, what they called a mammy back then. But Mary does not inherit any of that enslaved property. So he doesn't come into ownership of any enslaved people that way either. So Lincoln never owns slaves himself.
I am aware of the time, but
yeah.
I did want to read this comment because it sums up your presentation today very well. Says, very thoughtful overview, Dr. McWhirter. Your presentations are always compelling and insightful. And I have to echo those sentiments because you are just such a wealth of knowledge. And we appreciate you sharing your expertise with us, again, for your encore presentation today. And, one of the things that struck me while I was listening to you talk, we talk about today politics and government, how everything is so divided. When you think back to the Civil War and how bad it was,
right.
It really does put things into perspective, and the things that we fight over today with our current political system the way that it is. So I really enjoyed your presentation, and I will this recording will be available for anyone who wants to view it again or to send it to someone who they think would enjoy it. Thank you again, Dr. McWhirter, and stay warm and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, come see us in Springfield at the museum. It's a cool place and we'll be happy to have you.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.